Hello there. This is All 24 News, special coverage on the Russia-Ukraine file coming to you live from Algiers. I'm your host, Karim Fazakri. So here's what's on tap today. More than 4 months after Russia invaded Ukraine, a war that was expected to be a Russian blitzkrieg, only to turn into a debacle for Moscow, has now evolved into a battle of inches with no end in sight. A geopolitical stamina contest in which President Vladimir Putin is gambling, according to analysts, that he can outlast a fickle, impatient West. President Biden has vowed to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, but neither he nor anyone else can say how long that will be or how much more than the United States and its allies can do over that distance, short of direct military intervention. At some point, officials acknowledge U.S. and European stocks of weapons will run low, while the United States has authorized $54 billion in military and other assistance. No one expects another $54 billion check when that runs out. So Mr. Biden and his team are searching for a long-term strategy at a time when the White House sees the dangers of escalation increasing, the prospects for a negotiated settlement still far off, and public wariness beginning to set in at home and abroad. More about these developments and other pressing issues on the ground in Ukraine with our panel of guests after this break. Hello again. So, as announced earlier, I am joined live via Skype by Harley Schlanger, Vice Chairman of the Schiller Institute Board from Germany. Thank you, gentlemen, for agreeing to be with us. Along with Ivan Ferstuk, editor at the New Voice of Ukraine from Kiev. Thank you for being with us, gentlemen. Before we delve into any discussion, I guess it's just fine to share with you the latest on the ground. A rocket struck Kharkiv on Saturday, killing at least 15 people, according to officials. The shelling destroyed one building and severely damaged another one nearby. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky responded saying that only modern and powerful weapons could stop Russia's attacks on his country.
In the last 24 hours alone, Russia has hit Mykolaiv and Kharkiv communities in Zaporozhye region. It targeted the residential area, absolutely on deliberate and purposeful basis. Ordinary houses, civilian objects, people. There are victims, dead, wounded. No day or night passes without the brutal strikes of Russian artillery in Donbas towns. Only modern and powerful weapons can really stop such terrorist actions.
So, Mr. Ivan Ferstuk, Ukraine also reported heavy Russian missile and rocket strikes in the east and south on Saturday. And Kharkiv governor said that missile strike on the northeastern city wounded 3 civilians, though Russia's maintained attacks appeared focused on the eastern industrial region of Donbas. Since you're in Kiev, what could you update us on the latest development there?
The first thing for us to understand the tactics which both armies use, our army, Ukrainian, and the Russian, is this is a tit-for-tat war which is tactically a dialogue. Like, we hit you there, you hit us there. We hit you there, and you do that. So both sides are trying to scale up their attacks and other operation to respond in a proper manner to the opposite side. So the big question is, why is Russia starting to put more pressure on the city of Kharkiv in northeastern Ukraine? Here's my answer to this. In that region, which is northeast, Russia has the leftovers of its 20th Army operating there. For several weeks, they didn't have proper tactical guidance, which is why Russian soldiers in that area were just wandering around the villages and the woods without a particular understanding what their assignments are. Now they've been ordered to create a battle group and fight their way all the way to the Donbass, which is to the south, to join the Russian army there. They were considering an option to retreat back to Russia, going through the border between Kharkiv region and Russian Federation. But they were ordered by Kremlin to keep fighting and join the Donbass operation. On the other side, our army is trying to encircle the Russian battle group in Kharkiv region. So the big question is whether the Russian soldiers near Kharkiv would be able to fight their way all the way to the Donbass, or they will be encircled and stopped and destroyed by the Ukrainian army. So Russia is putting more pressure on the city of Kharkiv. So the Ukrainian army there would let Russian army retreat to their positions. This is like a dialogue, like, the military argument, let our people go. That's what Russians tell us. And then in the Donbass, the intensity of fighting has been so high for the past 2 weeks, which came a little bit as a surprise to many of us, since we've expected the Russian army to be pretty much exhausted by the beginning of July, but that hasn't happened, unfortunately. However, the future of this Donbass combat depends on whether Ukrainian army would be able to evacuate all the civilians from there, so it could move on to different tactics. So far, Ukrainian army always has to keep alive of the civilian population in their tactical equation, which means there have to be much lesser combat activity from the Ukrainian side to let people survive. But after the civilians will be evacuated from the Donbass region, Ukrainian army would be able to put as much artillery fire on the Russian army positions as needed, as is possible.
Understood.
And this is like the main thing, getting civilians out of the combat zone. I mean, you have like women running around on the streets where like Russian machine guns are working. That's obviously not a normal thing.
Very nice indeed. Mr. Hali Schlenger, Ukrainian officials reported strikes in both Luhansk and Donetsk. According to Ukrainian officials in the Donbass, the operational pause announced days ago by Russia has not been materialized. What's your reading on Russia's strategy now?
Well, I want to go back and just answer a couple of points here. I keep hearing President Zelensky saying he wants peace. If he wants peace, stop demanding weapons from the West. If the West wants peace, stop sending weapons in. If your other guest is concerned about civilian lives in the Donbass, what was done over 8 years when Ukrainian forces, including the extreme right forces of the Azov Battalion and others, were shelling civilians in the Donbass and killing many of them? The issue here is, how do you get out of a war which is harming the people of Ukraine dramatically, is harming the infrastructure of Ukraine, which is stretching Russia, but because of the tactics of the West, is now, with sanctions and so on, is backfiring against the people in the West. Here in Germany, we're seeing inflation going out of control. We're seeing shortages of energy. There are strikes of farmers throughout Western Europe. There are strikes in the United Kingdom. The Boris Johnson government just fell. There's instability everywhere. This is not the time to send more weapons in and to increase the fight. The Russian strategy is clear. They intend to drive the Ukrainian army out of the Donbass. They've succeeded in Lugansk. They're trying to do it in Donetsk. It may take a while to do it. I would strongly urge any Ukrainian patriot to put pressure on President Zelensky, stop the fighting, negotiate, and stop demanding more weapons, because the weapons manufacturers in the West are happy to build more weapons and send them to Ukraine.
Very nice indeed. Mr. Ivan, perhaps you can answer our distinguished guest, since Moscow has made it really clear that it is planning to dominate the Donetsk region, which paves the way to occupy the entire Donbass, just as our distinguished guest explained. Are the defensive weapons coming from the US doing enough to stop the Russian advancement? Apparently not. And this flow of armament to Ukraine is only putting oil on fire, according to our guest. How do you respond to that?
Ukrainian strategy for the Donbass is pretty much clear. The Russian army has been controlling these big cities of the Donbass for 8 years, as another guest said, which is true. And, nothing really good happened to the Donbass people in terms of quality of life. They had prisons, they had human rights violations. So Ukrainian army felt its moral obligation to liberate the people of Donbass and let them have the quality of life that they're deserving. I mean, Ukraine is about to join the European Union and get enormous amount of financial support to make the life of Ukrainian people much better than it used to. So we obviously want the Donbass population to participate in this and get benefits from reconstructing Ukraine. I mean, the quality of life in Russia-occupied territories is very, very low. Basic services are not working. There is no running water, no internet connection pretty much, and hospital care is unavailable. So we don't want that kind of quality for the Donbass people. Why the artillery our army gets from the West? Let us and all the Donbass people have hope for better life. And in terms of military technologies, it's really important to get the modern day experience for this latest waves of artillery, which is like HIMARS, rocket launchers, which are extremely powerful in what they do in the Donbass area. Then also the European artillery, including German, of course, which are also very, very powerful. So we need all of us here and our Western partners to get more experience in fighting the war and bringing the security risks down all the way. I mean, we're living in a risky world, lots of security troubles everywhere. And now in Ukraine, we're practicing the military technologies to stop the invaders who think there are no basic rules for security-based world order. That matters a lot to us. And the last thing, Ukraine is not like a standalone country that just does whatever it wants. It is part of the bigger alliance of democratic nations where the decisions are made based on consensus. So on all other tactical and strategic things, the Kyiv government of Volodymyr Zelensky is in a direct touch with the Western partners, with the United States administration, with the United Kingdom administration, then also with the European Union. So it's like our common effort where we obviously take into the equation the economic considerations, economic instability that the other guest was talking about, like inflation. And we really hope that the war will be ended as soon as possible in Ukraine's best interest, while I still think there is a lot to be done on the diplomatic side of the war. We still have lots of things to negotiate about, especially when it comes to human rights protection, especially in the occupied territories. So we have things to talk to between Ukraine and Russia.
Mr. Ivan Verstuk, Mr. Hawley pointed to the fact that perhaps only modern and powerful weapons could stop Russia's attacks, but this is only fueling the war. And the West have been sending more than enough military for Ukraine. What kind of modern weapons is the Ukrainian president looking for? I mean, how long this will go exactly, what the trajectory will be? We don't know right now, but we know if the US doesn't continue to support Ukraine, perhaps the outcome will be much worse. How do you see it, Mr. Verstuk, and how do you answer Mr. Hawley?
Well, let me answer that because he raised some questions about what I had said.
Yes.
Look, if you're concerned about the population of the Donbass, why did the Ukrainian government not stick with the Minsk II agreement? If the Europeans wanted peace, why did they not pressure the Ukraine government to follow through with Minsk II, which would have ended the war that was going on in eastern Ukraine, which was being carried there by the Ukrainian army? You want to talk about consent? The Western Europeans are, well, not so much the Western Europeans, the Americans and the British are aiming not to defend Ukrainian prosperity and democracy. They imposed the International Monetary Fund policies on Ukraine after the February 2014 coup, which lowered the standard of living in Ukraine. That is, the Western powers put policies, economic policies, that made people poorer in Ukraine, not the Russians. So the question now is, what is it that the Europeans and the Americans want? They don't want Ukrainian freedom. They want to weaken Russia. And why is that? Because the Western economy is collapsing. And the Russians...
And what will the outcome be like, Mr. Harley Schlenger, if we're speaking about the U.S. here? What will be the outcome if U.S. stops supporting this war?
Well, the outcome will be that Zelensky will have to negotiate, or whoever replaces him will have to negotiate. President Putin has made clear that if the Ukraine's joining NATO is taken off the table, then he's willing to have security guarantees for Ukraine, but not until there are security guarantees for Russia. And this is what is not being discussed from the Ukrainian side. The idea that you can move modern offensive weapons onto the Russian border without Russia reacting is just absurd. For the same reason John Kennedy reacted when the Soviet Union put missiles into Cuba. So peace depends on both sides pulling back, but it depends on the West stopping the sacrifice of Ukrainian lives to undermine Russia. This, to me, is the greatest human rights violation, that the Western governments are willing to provide weapons to Ukrainians to have Ukrainians be killed by continuing the war.
Especially under the recent threat that Vladimir Putin just actually announced when he said that we are just warming up and the real business didn't really start. So what can you say, Mr. Ivan Farstuk, on the statements of Mr. Harley Schlenger?
Let me say this. Ukraine doesn't operate politically in a vacuum, right? We have the whole lots of international law principles and international agreements guaranteeing Ukraine's security, which Ukraine has been sticking to much earlier than the Minsk agreements that you're talking to. And nevertheless, after the February 24th invasion, Minsk agreements are as useful now as probably the results of the Nuremberg process after the World War II. This is a thing that has been gone for a long time. We have totally different reality right now. And you know, in Ukraine, we have our constitution, which was passed back in the 1996, which gives the direct list of which territories are part of Ukraine. So as long as the Ukrainian army stops protecting those territories, they're breaking the country's constitution, which is a law that we're living by. You know, for any European nation, implementing the basic laws to provide the citizens the security they need, that's the most essential thing. And now let's take the cultural thing. I mean, Ukraine has been a neighbor to Russia for centuries, and for centuries it lived under the Russian rule. So most of the Ukrainians do know the feeling of how does it feel to live under the Kremlin regime. And this doesn't feel well. You have all kinds of poverty, you have like KGB services going after you and your family, you have all kinds of human rights violation all the time in your daily life. So for most of us, for like 95% people here in Ukraine, you know, living under the Russian rule is not an option at all. We know pretty well that Russia is not able to bring the quality of life that their own population needs. I mean, take a look at Russia's northern regions. They're extremely...
So, Mr. Ivan Farstuk, you are with the side that say that let's continue the war until we bring that kind of independence that you're looking for and maybe liberating the Donbas region. How realistic is that, according to you, Mr. Farstuk?
I think we should look at both sides of the war, which is like south and east. Ukrainian army is doing extremely good job in the south, producing huge territorial advance with liberating cities and villages in southern Ukraine. So there are not many reasons to put doubts about the successful results of the counteroffensive operation in the south. When we discuss the Donbass, I'm sure we should be at first thinking about going back to February 23rd line and then see what's going to happen next. Politically, it would be stronger to talk to Russia after we complete the mission that we are and our army is doing now in the Donbass. We can't just stop doing things there, because that wouldn't be supported by Ukraine's Western allies that we are talking to all the time. So let me finalize what I'm saying on the Donbass. First thing is that we are intended to go back to the February 23rd line and then see what happens, and it also include diplomatic negotiations in this. I mean, to me, it's always people's lives matter the most. The most people, civilians.
And speaking of the advancement, Mr. Ivan Fastuk, apparently these kind of advancement cannot happen without the Western's help. And here, British-made armored vehicles FV-103 Spartan arrived on the front line in the Donbas region, where a Ukrainian tank commander from the 14th Mechanized Brigade says the Ukrainian army still needs tanks, howitzers, and lots of long-range artillery.
They have a lot of resources because this is a big country, and this country is an aggressor who is always at war, who always accumulates weapons. We can oppose them, but above all, we need machines, weapons, and motivation.
So back to you, Mr. Howley Schlenger. Many analysts raise the concern about the fatigue factor of the public in a wide range of countries because of the economic costs and because there are other pressing concerns at home, that is. How do you see that, and what's your prediction of the trajectory of this war?
Well, the idea of war fatigue is clear in terms of the economic problems afflicting the Western countries right now. But to go back to a couple of points about international agreements. Ukraine broke an agreement that it made with France and Germany called Minsk II. You can say it's no longer applicable, but it shows that Ukrainian government cannot be trusted to live up to its agreements, which is a problem. Secondly, you talk about freedom and democracy in Russia. What about Zelensky banning all opposition parties, shutting down newspapers, jailing opposition? This is not democracy and freedom. Then you add one final point here, which is that and I hate to tell you this, Ivan, there's no way you're going to win this war because the West will not keep pouring weapons into Ukraine as Western countries are going into a deepening economic crisis. We see this in Britain with the fall of Boris Johnson. It's not just that he's a liar and violated his own agreements. It's that the British people are suffering by 9% inflation while the British government is pouring weapons into Ukraine. The Western countries are not committed to continuing this flow of arms. So there has to be a change, and the change has to come from an agreement to negotiate. And the problem that I have with some of your comments is that you're ignoring the fact that the Ukrainian government of Zelensky, who came into office, he ran as a peace candidate saying he would implement Minsk II, he never did. And partly because of the pressure on him from the extreme right, from the Pravi sector, from the Azov battalion and others, which told him if he negotiates the Minsk II, he will be hanging from a tree. So Ukraine has to straighten up its internal situation, and the best way to do that is stop the fighting, reach an agreement, security agreements, negotiate over time the borders and so on, but stop the fighting. It's a suicide for the people of Ukraine being imposed on them by the war hawks in the West who are making huge amounts of money by building more weapons to send to Ukraine to be destroyed by the Russians.
How do you respond, Mr. Ivan Fastuk? I leave you the opportunity to get back to Mr. Howley Schlenger.
If Mr. Howley Schlenger thinks I'm happy about how things are in Ukraine, I'm not happy at all. Come on, I'm in Kiev, I'm living through the war and going through these major problems everywhere. I mean, I have to care about safety and security of my family, my friends. Think about all kinds of risks around me. I'm not happy at all. But on the other hand, winning the war is the only way for us to feel safe. I mean, we've sacrificed a lot as a nation to get the Russian army out of our territory. That means a whole lot to us. Ukraine has this strong solidarity of having political independence, which was gained through the centuries of historical development of our nation, and that means a whole deal to us. It's like our key political priority. There is no discussion whether Ukraine wants or doesn't want to win the war. I mean, 95% of the population supports winning the war. It's like a popular idea. So no matter what the critics say about Ukraine's military strategy and foreign policy approach, we have like operating democracy here, and the government of Zelensky has to do what people wanted to do.
But Mr. Ivan Farsuk, Mr. Harley Schlanger was just pointing to a realistic idea, is that these economic repercussions of this war domestically at these Western countries are actually having a great toll on the population's purchasing power, and it's putting a lot of pressure and the collapse of many governments, which means that the support of Western nations is not going to continue for Ukraine to win this war. So how realistic can we be here?
The first thing I just want to say is that we have this G7 pledge, which was made recently by G7 leaders, who would say that Ukraine would be getting any kind of support for as long term as the country needs. So after this pledge, we feel ourselves much better in terms of planning our economic future. Of course, we are in a deep economic crisis. We do not have a healthy economy anymore. I mean, it's close to impossible to find a job in Kiev these days, and people still, to somehow have to make their living. I mean, economically, we're in deep trouble, and that's something that the government of Volodymyr Zelensky should obviously be taken care of very intensively, since the situation for some of the Ukrainians is critical. They need jobs. They need financial stability, and with the inflation, which also affects
Yes,
Ukraine.
but where is the solution, Mr. Ivan Farsuk? And I guess Mr. Harley Schlanger would like to get back to you on those comments. Yes, Mr. Harley Schlanger.
Yeah, look, the economic problems in Ukraine predated the Russian military operations. The IMF figures show Ukraine is unable to pay its foreign debt. Ukraine has had a decline in its standard of living from 2014 to the present because of the policies the Western governments, your so-called allies, are imposing on you. This happened long before Putin decided to send troops into Ukraine. And now you're expecting those same governments that made your country poorer and that wants to grab the grain and grab the resources of Ukraine to pay that debt. You think they're going to help you? They're increasing your debt by selling you weapons. This is not a policy for the Ukrainian people. And I urge you to rethink this idea and look at Afghanistan. What happened after the war ended there? The West ran away, stole the money from Afghanistan, $9 billion, and left the people there in a harsh winter with no food. The same future awaits Ukraine, not from Putin, but from your so-called Western allies who are using the Ukrainian people. And I have total sympathy with you on this question of security and financial prosperity. But I'm telling you, it's the bankers, the International Monetary Fund, it's NATO, it's the United Kingdom, it's the United States, which is imposing this on you. And relying on them to get you out of this is a big mistake. Don't make that mistake, the same mistake that was made by the Libyans, by the Iraqis, and by the Afghan people.
So Mr. Ivan Farsuk is just all this help and support is an evil in disguise. What can you say, Mr. Ivan Farsuk?
my argument on the economic side would be, well, Ukraine has never been especially rich. It's a post-Soviet country that inherited lots of poverty from the Soviet times when the Ukraine was ruled by Moscow elites and Kremlin's policies. And whenever we start getting better, I mean, like in 2019 and 2021. In some quarters, we had the economy growing over 4 and 5%, which is, a pretty good rate for a big economy like Ukraine, where like 40 million people used to live. So, we were getting better economically. If you look at the banking sector in Ukraine, it's much stronger, used to be much stronger than the Russian banking sector. The technology sector was much better than what the Russians did. And as soon as the Ukrainian economy and Ukrainian business started showing this greater degree of sophistication and technologies and attracting capital than the Russian economy, then the Kremlin felt jealous. Vladimir Putin can't live with an idea of Ukraine being richer than Russia. That's why his decision is, he doesn't want Ukraine to be a successful example of the post-Soviet economy becoming a prosperous European nation. He wants to stop it. He couldn't stop it.
Understood, Mr. Ivan Farsuk. So, as a final question to wrap this up, Mr. Hali Schlanger, in a press conference of the G20 summit meeting, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that China should not be neutral about the war in Ukraine. He stressed that the U.S.-China relationship is beneficial to the whole world. What's your comment about this? How can the bilateral relations between U.S. and China benefit the whole world?
I think Tony Blinken is a hypocrite. He's involved in policies of extending NATO to Asia. The idea now is to have a global NATO to contain Russia and to contain China. And I would simply add that what was done to Ukraine at the end of the Soviet times was the same thing done to Russia. The bankers came in and looted the country. If you look, Ivan, at IMF figures, Ukrainians were more wealthy in 1991 than they are today. And it went from bad to worse after 2014. The reforms the Western banks are pushing in Ukraine are making the oligarchs stronger, the bankers stronger, but the people poorer. And I think the important question here is, why is Russia not suffering so much from the sanctions? Because they
Understood,
have
Mr. Hali Schlanger. Thank you so much. The discussion with you, dear guests, is really exciting. Yet again, the time is running out, so we have to wrap this up. Thank you, dear guests, for your thorough analysis, and thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. Bye for now.